Hurry up, guys. Every single person have to write your name in the chat, guys. Making a like and subscribing to the channel. A lot of love and respect for you joining, guys. Every respected member have to write your name in the chat. Oh, guys, think anyone is in the chat. 1 second, guys. Thank you so much. Every respected member have to write your name in the chat, guys. Making the like and subscribing to the channel. Hurry up, guys. A lot of love and respect for you joining. Thank you, Mara. Hurry up, Mara. Thank you so much for joining to stream. Pretty Mara. How are you, dear Marwa? Thank you so much for your joining to the stream. Avanti, how are you, dear Avanti? Thank you so much for joining to the stream. Shahiba, how are you, Shahiba? Thank you so much for joining to the stream, Shahiba. Alison, how are you, Alison? Thank you so much for joining to the stream, dear Alison. Dexon, how are you, Dexon? Thank you so much for joining to the stream. Yeah, guys, every respected member have to write your name in the chat. City Boy, how are you, City Boy? Thank you so much for joining. Leusa, how are you, pretty Leusa? Thank you so much for you joining, pretty Leusa. A lot of love and respect for you joining, pretty. Thank you so much. Zara, how are you, pretty Zara? Thank you so much for joining to the stream, pretty Zara. Hurry up, guys, to write your name in the chat, guys. Say hello to me. I am Mexico. My name is Hi Genian. Thank you so much for joining. Hello Genian. Thank you so much for joining to the stream. The Mexico girl. Thank you so much for joining. Thank you, pretty. Thank you so much for joining to the stream. Dexon, I write your name, my dear. Why you are spamming? Damla, how are you, dear Damla? Thank you so much for joining to a stream, Dimala. And Leoza, how are you, dear Leoza? Thank you so much for joining to a stream, Leoza. Thank you so much for joining to a stream. Hassan, how are you, dear Hassan? Thank you so much for joining to the stream, dear Hassan. A lot of love and respect for you joining. Agnes, how are you, Agnes? Thank you so much for joining to the stream. Ali, how are you, pretty Ali? How are you, Ali? Thank you so much for joining. Please, guys, someone has to send a laughing disco, guys. Yeah, guys, do a super chat. Send a laughing disco. Yogmore, how are you, Yogmore? Thank you so much for joining to the stream. Thank you. Jamala, how are you, Jamala? Thank you so much for joining to the stream. Jamala, how are you, Jamal? Arham, how are you, dear Arham? Thank you so much for joining to the stream, dear Arham. How are you, dear Arham? Thank you so much for joining. Yusuf, how are you, Yusuf? Thank you so much for joining to the stream, dear Yusuf. Carol, how are you, Carol? Thank you so much for joining to the stream. Carlos, how are you, Carlos? Thank you so much for joining. Manha, how are you, pretty Manha? Thank you so much for joining to the stream. Demala, how are you, Demala? Thank you so much for joining, Demala. Lucy, how are you, dear Lucy? Thank you so much for joining, Lucy. Carrie, how are you, dear Carrie? Thank you so much for joining to the stream. How are you, dear Carrie? Alinde, how are you, dear Alinde? Thank you so much for joining. Alede, how are you, Alede? Thank you so much for joining to City Ring. Amir, how are you, Amir? Thank you so much for joining to City Ring. Ava, how are you, dear Ava? Thank you so much for joining. Hi, dear Letu. How are you, Letu? Thank you so much for joining. Thank you so much for joining my stream for the today. Thank you. How is your day going, my dear? Can you send a laughing disco today for the today session, my dear? Exal, how are you, Exal? Thank you so much for joining. Larry, how are you, Larry? Thank you so much for joining to the stream, Larry. Thank you so much for joining, Larry. Color, how are you, Color? Thank you so much for joining, lovely Color. Thank you so much for your joining, dear. Thank you. Mara, how are you, Mara? Thank you so much for joining to the city room, dear Mara. A lot of love and respect for your joining. Jeannie, how are you, Jeannie? Thank you so much for joining to the city room. Canon, how are you, dear Sanon? How are you, Sanon? Thank you so much for joining to City Rain. Amna, how are you, dear Amna? Thank you so much for the star. Thank you. Thank you, Color. Can you send out laughing disco for the today, my dear? Alotka, how are you, Alotka? Thank you so much for joining. Adam, how are you, dear Adam? Thank you so much for joining. Lazy, how are you, dear Lazy? Thank you so much for joining to us. Azzy, how are you, dear Azzy? Thank you so much for joining to us. City Ring. Sari, how are you, dear Sari? Thank you so much for joining to the City Ring, Sari. And Dago, how are you, dear Dago? Thank you so much for joining to City Ring, Dago. Thank you. And Jamina, how are you, Jamina? Thank you so much for joining to the City Ring, Jamina. Megan, how are you, dear Megan? Thank you so much for joining to the city room, dear Megan. Yeah, thank you. Foria, how are you, Foria? Thank you so much for joining to the city room, Foria. How are you, Foria? Thank you, Foria. Jamina, alright, Jenny. What is that, Jamina? Look that, yeah. Yonchi, how are you, Yonchi? Thank you so much for joining to the city room, Yonchi. How are you, Yonchi? Thank you so much for joining. Omar, how are you, Omar? Thank you so much for joining to the city ring. Sale, how are you, dear Sale? Thank you so much for joining, Sale. How are you, Sale? Lara, how are you, Lara? Thank you so much for joining, dear Lara. Frank, how are you, dear Frank? Thank you so much for joining, Frank. Jamina, how are you, Jamina? Jamina, it's a last warning. Then you will be got the time out from here. Thank you so much for joining to City Ring. Thank you so much. Todd, how are you, dear Todd? Thank you so much for joining, Todd. Leah, how are you, dear Leah? Thank you so much, dear Leah. Manoon, how are you, Manoon? Thank you so much for joining, Manoon. Alicia, how are you, dear Alicia? Thank you so much for joining to City Rim, dear Alicia. Manoon, how are you, dear Manoon? Thank you so much for joining, Manoon. Dominic, how are you, Dominic? Thank you so much for joining, Dominic. Yasamin, how are you, pretty Yasamin? Thank you so much for joining to City Rim, Yasamin. Yeah. Every respected member have to write your name in the chat, guys, making the like and subscribing to the channel. Sophia, how are you, Sophia? Thank you so much for joining to the city room. Thank you so much for your joining. And Geo again, how are you, Geo again? Thank you so much for joining. Laris, how are you, Laris? Thank you so much for joining, Yaris. Danara, how are you, Dinara? Thank you so much for joining, Dinara. A lot of love and respect. And Dennis, how are you, Dennis? Thank you so much for joining, Dennis. Serene, how are you, Serene? Thank you so much for joining to Citrine. Ashlyn, how are you, Ashlyn? Thank you so much for joining to Citrine. Jessica, how are you, Jessica? Thank you so much for joining to Citrine, Jessica. Rosie, how are you, Rosie? Thank you so much for joining, Rosie. Maddie, how are you, Maddie? Thank you so much for joining to Citrine, Maddie. How are you, Maddie? Katsy, how are you, Katsy? Thank you so much for joining. Lily, how are you, pretty Lily? Thank you so much for joining, Lily. Aris, how are you there, Aris? Thank you so much for joining to Citrine. Liseli, how are you, Liseli? Thank you so much for joining to Citrine, dear Liseli. Sorry guys, Jessica, I write your name there. Mio, how are you, Mio? Thank you so much for joining to stream, dear Mio. How are you, Mio? Yusuf, how are you, Yusuf? Thank you so much for joining to stream. Jessica, here is right your name there. Looks that. Thank you. Angel, how are you, dear Angel? Thank you so much for joining to stream, Angel. How are you, Angel? Yara, how are you, Yara? Thank you so much for joining, Yara. Narine, how are you, Narine? Thank you so much for joining, Narine. RP, how are you, dear RP? Thank you so much for joining, RP. Ali, how are you, dear Ali? Thank you so much for joining, Ali. Zinab, how are you, dear Zin? Yeah, Zinab, how are you, Zinab? Thank you so much for joining. Simura, how are you, dear Simura? How are you, Simura? Maris, how are you, Maris? Thank you so much for joining to Citrine, Maris. Lilan, how are you, dear Lilan? Thank you so much for joining to Citrine, Lilin. Harris, how are you, Harris? Thank you so much for joining, Harris. Jima, how are you, dear Jima? Thank you so much for joining, Jima. How are you, Jima? Thank you so much for joining, Jima. Hamid, how are you, dear Hamid? Thank you, Hamid. Minsa, how are you, Minsa? Thank you so much for joining, Minsa. Macaulay, how are you, Macaulay? Thank you so much for joining to Citrine, Macaulay. Angela, how are you, dear Angela? Thank you so much for joining. Kale, how are you, dear Kale? Thank you so much for joining to Citrine, Kale. Elia, how are you, dear Elia? Thank you so much for joining, Elia. Cheyenne, how are you, dear Cheyenne? Thank you so much for joining to Citrine, dear Cheyenne. Angela, how are you, dear Angela? Thank you so much for joining. Mohit, how are you, Mohit? Hurry up, guys. Asili, how are you, pretty Alice? How are you, Alice? Alisla, how are you, Alisla? Thank you so much, Ibrahim. How are you, Ibrahim? Kalare, how are you, Kalare? Thank you so much for joining to the city ring. Angela, how are you, Angela? Thank you so much for joining, Angela. Brahim, how are you, dear Brahim? Thank you so much for joining, Brahim. Hurry up, guys, to write your name in the chat, guys. Danara, how are you, Danara? Thank you so much for joining to city ring, Danara. Alpha, I write your name earlier. Irene, how are you, dear Irene? Thank you so much for joining to the city ring, Irene. Hassan, how are you, dear Hassan? Thank you so much for joining. Taran, how are you, Taran? Thank you so much for joining. Aveline, how are you, dear Aveline? How are you, dear Aveline? Thank you so much for joining to the city ring. Please, guys, do a super chat or send a laughing disco. Yeah, guys, send a laughing disco. Do a super chat, guys. Make a small donation, guys. Hurry up, guys, to write your name in the chat, guys. Making the like and subscribing to the channel. I have a lot of love and respect for you, Johnny. Leo, I write your name on there, Leo. Weston, how are you, Weston? Thank you so much for your joining, Weston. Alijo, how are you, dear Alijo? Thank you so much for joining to Esotery. Nitala, how are you, Nitala? Thank you so much for joining to Esotery, Nitalia. Hurry up, guys. If you are spam, you have to send a lot of names, then you will be get the time order from the screen, guys. Yeah, if you have tried to spam, then you will be get the time order and the screen, guys. Don't spam to give you a time of the every people have to writing in the name. Yeah, Clara, how are you, Clara? Jonah, how are you, dear Jonah? Thank you so much for joining to the room, Jonah. Kimari, how are you, Kimari? Thank you so much for joining, Kimari. Ava, how are you, dear Ava? Thank you so much for joining, dear Ava. Hurry up, guys. Write your name in the chat, guys. Helena, how are you, Helena? Thank you so much, Helena. Zainab, I have write your name, my dear. I write your name. Nolan, how are you, Nolan? Lexi, how are you, dear Lexi? Thank you so much for joining, Lexi. Leos, how are you, Leos? How are you, Leos? Thank you so much for joining, Leos. Nelso, how are you, Nelso? How are you, Nilso? Thank you so much for joining to Citrine. Mia, how are you, dear Mia? Thank you so much for joining. Nalos, how are you, Nalos? Thank you so much for Nelso, how are you, Nelso? Thank you so much for joining. Yeah, guys, Yusuf, I write your name, my lovely brother. To write your name in the chat, guys, making the like, subscribing to the channel. Kana, how are you, Kana? Shame, welcome there. Please, guys, someone do a super chat, guys. Mila, how are you, Mila? Thank you so much for joining, Mila. How are you, Mila? Sham, I write your name, Manir. Hassan, how are you, Hassan? Thank you. Maria, how are you, Maria? Thank you so much for joining, Maria. Felix, how are you, Felix? Thank you so much, Felix. Malki, how are you, Maliki? How are you, Maliki? Jodit, how are you, Jodit? Thank you so much for joining. Celine, how are you, Celine? Thank you so much, Celine. Dennis, how are you, Dennis? Liz, thank you so much for subscribing. Thank you, Liz. Vishu, how are you, Vishu? To write your name in the chat, guys, making the like and subscribing to the channel. Anabia, hurry, Anabia. Thank you so much for joining to Citrim, Anabia. How are you, Anabia? Zoe, how are you, Zoe? Anaya, how are you, Anaya? Thank you so much for joining, Anaya. Abuzer, how are you, Abuzer? Thank you so much for joining, Abuzer. Ashley, how are you, Ashley? Yeah, I'm a blind there. Akala, how are you, Akala? Thank you so much for joining, Akala. Please, guys, someone has sent a laughing disco, guys. Alison, how are you, dear Alison? How are you, Alison? Thank you so much for joining to such a rain, dear Alison. Hurry up, guys. Do super chat, guys. Emma, how are you, dear Emma? Someone do a super chat, guys. And Nina, how are you, Nina? Thank you so much for joining, Nina. Welcome, dear. You should write your name. I will write your name. You do not have to write on your name in my search. Thank you. If someone has to written wrong, the your comments has been yeah, your comment should be disappear if you have to write or wrong anything. Asia, how are you, dear Asia? Yeah, YouTube have did not show the wrong message on the screen. Namor, how are you, Namor? Thank you so much for joining to stream, Namor. You should if you should be write your name. Yeah, your name should be would be shown on the screen. Yeah. Arman, how are you, Arman? Thank you so much for joining, Arman. Riley, how are you, Riley? Thank you so much for joining to stream, Riley. A lot of love and respect for you joining the Riley. Thank you, Riley. Namor, how are you, Namor? Thank you so much for joining. German, how are you, German? Yara, how are you, Yara? Hurry up, guys, to write your name in the chat, guys. Hi there, hi. Advin, how are you, dear Advin? Thank you so much for joining, dear Advin. Lala, how are you, Lala? Guys, please send a laughing disco, guys. Do a super chat, send a laughing disco, and also, yeah, guys, also do a super chat, guys. Make a small donation for the setting. Messi is your boyfriend, okay? Hi, Messi. Zarifi, how are you, Zarifi? Thank you so much for joining, Zarifi. Chio, how are you, Chio? Don, how are you, Don? Adorado, how are you, dear Adorado? Thank you so much for joining to the city. Every single person have to write your name in the chat, guys, and making the like, subscribing to the channel. You should have to do a super, guys. Click on the goal, guys. Make a small donation. Ava, how are you, dear Ava? Thank you so much for joining, Ava. How are you, Ava? Jojo, how are you, Jojo? Thank you so much for joining, Jojo. Ava, I write your name, my dear. Hi again, dear Jojo. Thank you, Jojo. Thank you, welcome, guys. Please, someone click, yeah, guys. Click on the money icon to do a super chat, guys. Evelyn, how are you, Evelyn? Thank you so much for joining, Evelyn. Yeah, guys, click on the money icon to do the super chat, my dear. Thank you. Nalin, how are you, dear Nalin? Thank you so much for joining, Nalin. Yonika, how are you, Yunaka, how are you, Yunaka? Thank you, Yunaka. Thank you. Alim, how are you, dear Alim? How are you, Alim? Thank you so much for joining, Alim. Matthew, Mayotu, how are you, Mayotu? Lucy, how are you, dear Lucy? Francisco, please guys send a super sticker, super chat, and also to send a gift, guys. Francisco, how are you, Francisco? How are you, Francisca? Thank you so much for joining to City. Nathan, how are you, Nathan? Thank you so much for joining, Nathan. How are you, Nathan? David, how are you, David? Santiago, how are you, Santiago? Thank you so much for joining, Santiago. Where are you from watching, David? Please, guys. Rico, how are you, Rico? Send us super sticker, guys. Yeah, send us super sticker. Send the laughing disco, guys. Yeah, anybody click on the money icon to do a super chat, guys, to help me to completing my goal. Thank you so much for you joining, guys. Mariam, how are you, Mariam? Thank you so much for joining to City Ring, Mariam. Leo, how are you, Leo? Lara, how are you, Lara? Aubrey, how are you, Aubrey? Thank you so much for joining, Aubrey. Welcome there, welcome. Guys, click on the money icon to help me completing my goal, guys. Alison, how are you, Alison? Thank you so much for joining to City Ring, Alison. To write your name in the chat, guys. Asted, how are you, Asted? Thank you so much for joining to City Ring, Asted. Carl, how are you, Carl? Thank you so much for joining, Carl. Sophia, how are you, dear Sophia? Thank you so much for joining, Sophia. Kyun, Kyunisi, how are you, Kyunisi? Thank you so much for joining. Omar, how are you, dear Omar? Thank you so much for joining, Omar. Hi, Zahed, how are you, dear? Zara, how are you, Zara? Malik, how are you, dear Malik? Thank you, Malik. Cameron, how are you, dear Cameron? Thank you so much for joining, Cameron. Hurry up, guys, to write your name in the chat, guys. 6-7, you sent a 6-7 there. Hurry up, guys, to write your name in the chat, guys. Ale, how are you, dear Ale? Thank you so much for your joining, Ale. How are you, dear Ale? Thank you so much for joining. And Dory, how are you, Dory? Thank you so much for joining to City Rim, Dory. And Dory, Wonchi, how are you, dear Won? Wonhi, how are you, Wonhi? Thank you so much for joining, Wonhi. Johnny, how are you, Johnny? Please, guys, somebody send a laughing disco or do a super chat, guys. Click on my goal, guys, to help me to completing my goal, guys. Yeah, Sion, how are you, Sion? Thank you, Sion. Richard, how are you, Richard? Samira, how are you, Samira? Yonchi, how are you, dear Yonchi? Zoli, how are you, dear Zoli? Dory, how are you, Dory? Thomas, how are you, Thomas? Ara, how are you, dear Ara? Thank you so much for joining Twisted Dream, Ara. To do a super chat, guys, send a laughing disco for the appreciation, guys. Making the like and subscribing to the channel. Alina, how are you, dear Alina? Thank you so much, Alina. Dennis, how are you, Dennis? Thank you so much for joining Twisted Dream, Dennis. Kara, how are you, dear Kara? Thank you so much for joining Twisted Dream, Kara. Emma, how are you, dear Emma? Thank you so much for joining Twisted Dream, Emma. Welcome, dear. Yeah, guys, please, guys, making the like, subscribing to the channel, and don't forget to sending the super chat or for making the donation or sending the laughing disco. Alma, how are you, dear Alma? Thank you, Alma. Jasmine, how are you, Jasmine? Thank you so much for joining to the stream, Jasmine. Azura, how are you, Azura? Thank you so much for joining to the stream, dear Azura. Hurry up, guys, to write your name, guys. Send the laughing disco, guys. Carol, how are you, Carol? Thank you so much for joining to the stream, Carol. Yeah, Asbela, how are you, dear Asbela? Thank you so much for joining to the stream. Alma. Alma, how are you, dear Alma? Thank you so much for joining. Lena, how are you, dear Lena? Thank you so much for joining to the stream, Lena. How are you, Lena? Leona, how are you, dear Leona? Please, guys, somebody do a super chat, guys. Thank you so much. Banny, how are you, dear Banny? Thank you so much for joining to the stream, Banny. How are you, Banny? Hello, hello, dear. Sad, how are you, dear Sad? Thank you, Sad. Please, guys, send a laughing disco or send a super sticker, guys. Fias, how are you, Fias? Thank you so much for joining. Yeah, guys, send a laughing disco. Zed Sol, how are you, Zed Sol? Yeah, guys, send a laughing disco, send a super sticker, guys. Hurry up, guys, please send Jennifer, how are you, Jennifer? Please send a laughing disco, guys. Please send a laughing disco or do a super chat, guys. Thank you so much for you joining, making the like and subscribing to the channel. Please, guys, anybody make a super chat for the goal, guys. Yeah, make a small donation, guys. My goal is a very small. Summer, how are you, Summer? Yeah, guys, it's not a big, guys, it's a small. Penny, how are you, dear Penny? Penny Love, how are you, Penny Love? Thank you so much for joining. Lajos, sorry, Lajos. Thank you, Lajos. Please, guys, someone send a super sticker. Yeah, guys, super chat. Hello, Bia. How are you, dear Bia? Thank you so much for joining, Bia. How are you, Bia? Raf K, how are you, dear Raf K? Thank you so much for joining, Raf K. Kamala, how are you, dear Kamalia? Thank you so much for joining, Kamala. Max, how are you, Max? Thank you so much, Max. Yovan, how are you, Yovan? Thank you so much for joining. Salivia, how are you, Salivia? Rafk, how are you, dear Rafk? Thank you. Namaku, how are you, Nimaku? Thank you so much for joining to Sitarim Rimaku. Rocky, how are you, dear Rocky? Thank you so much for joining to Sitarim. Aline, how are you, dear Aline? Thank you so much for joining, dear Aline. Welcome, please, guys. Aline, I write your name. Yeah, please, guys, click on my goal, guys. Send us, do a super chat, guys. Make a small donation, guys. Yeah, to make a small donation for the appreciation, guys. To write your name in the chat. Harry, how are you, dear Harry? Thank you so much for joining to stream, dear Harry. Francisco, how are you, dear Francisco? How are you, Francisco? How are you, Francisco? Thank you so much, Francisco. Thank you so much for joining, Francisco. Lulu, how are you, Lulu? Hassan, how are you, dear Hassan? Thank you so much, Hassan. Claire, how are you, Claire? Claire, Alma, how are you, dear Alma? Thank you, Alma. Hurry up, guys. Do a super chat, guys. Do a super chat. Do a super chat, guys, please. I will stop. Thank you. Thank you. Alice, how are you, Alice? Thank you so much for joining to stream, Alice. Davi, how are you, Dava? Thank you so much for joining. Sadni, how are you, Sadni? Thank you so much for joining to stream, Sadni. Ibrahim, how are you, dear Ibrahim? Thank you so much for joining, Ibrahim. Gone, how are you, dear Gone? Thank you so much for joining, Gone. How are you, Gone? Please, guys, send a laughing disco, guys, and try to completing my goal. A lot of love. And can you put my cousin name? Halle. Why not, my dear? Hi, Halle. How are you, Halle? How are you, Halle? Thank you so much for joining my stream. Where are you from watching, dear? Kara, how are you, dear Kara? Thank you so much for joining to stream. Please, guys, someone do a super chat. Kara, I write your name, my dear. Alper, how are you? Alper, thank you so much for joining. Alper, how are you? Alper, thanks. Welcome there. Max, how are you? Max, please, guys. And she is from Spain. Oh, that's great. You are from Spain. Thank you. Can you do a super chat, my dear? Click on my gold. Click on the money icon. Click on the money icon to do a super chat, my dear. Leon, how are you, dear Leon? Thank you so much for joining, Leon. How are you, Leon? Yeah, Shanna, how are you, dear Shanna? Thank you so much for joining to sit in, dear Shanna. Thank you. To write your name in the chat, guys, making the like and subscribing to the channel. A lot of love and respect for you, joining. Shahita, how are you, Shahita? Thank you so much for joining. Megan, how are you, dear Megan? Thank you so much for joining to City Ring. Summer, how are you, Summer? Thank you so much for joining to City Ring, Summer. Gabe, how are you, dear Gabe? Thank you so much for joining to City Ring, Gabe. Aline, how are you, dear Alan? Thank you so much for joining to City Ring, Alian. How are you, Alian? Jare, how are you, dear Jare? Thank you so much for joining, Jare. Summer, how are you, Summer? Matthew, how are you, Matthew? Thank you so much for joining to the City Ring, Matthew. Darky, how are you, Darky? Thank you so much for joining. Bia, how are you, Bia? Thank you so much for joining, Bia. Marcus, how are you, Marcus? Thank you so much for joining. Lucia, how are you, dear Lucia? Luisa, how are you, Luisa? Anybody can do a super chat, guys. Lara, how are you, Lara? Jesse, how are you, Jesse? Hurry up, guys, to write your name in the chat, guys, making the like and subscribing to the channel. Okay, my dear. Buglam, how are you, Buglam? Jessica, how are you, Jessica? Please, guys, to write your name in the chat, guys, making the like and subscribing to the channel. Alisa, how are you, Alisa? Thank you so much for joining, Alisa. How are you, Asila? How are you, Asila? Thank you so much for joining. Fron, how are you, Firan? Jassy, how are you, Jassy? Thank you. Leora, how are you, Leora? Please, guys, someone send a laughing disco, guys. Aura, how are you, Aura? Please, guys, someone send a laughing disco, guys. Are full lost it. Felix, sorry, Felix. Where are you from watching, dear Felix? Thank you so much for joining, Felix. Please, someone send us laughing disco, guys. Any superhero can send a laughing disco, guys. Our super chat. I'm from Turkey. Thank you so much for watching from Turkey. Fazal, how are you, Fazal? Please, guys, somebody else send a laughing disco, guys. Thank you. Amina, how are you, dear Amina? How are you, Amina? Thank you so much for joining to City Ring, Amina. Kari, how are you, Kari? Thank you so much for joining to City Ring. Hyunjin, how are you, Hyunjin? Ava, how are you, dear Ava? Thank you so much for joining, Ava. Samoon, how are you, Samoon? Thank you so much for joining. Kari, are you blind, dear? Are you blind? Kari, are you blind? Avi, are you blind, my lovely brother? Samoon, how are you, Samoon? Zana, how are you, Zana? Thank you so much for joining to City Ring, Zana. Avi, how are you, dear Avi? Thank you so much for joining, Avi. Nina, how are you, Nina? Dara, how are you, Dara? Thank you so much for joining, Dara. Ali, how are you, Ali? Thank you so much for joining to City Ring, Ali. How are you, Ali? Naja, how are you, Naja? Thank you so much for joining, Naja. Lolita, how are you, Lolita? Thank you so much for joining to City Ring, Lolita. Minyu, how are you, Minyu? Please, guys, someone has to collect on my goal, guys. Collect on my goal to do a super chat by goal, guys. Anybody is going to sending a laughing disco, guys? Angelo, how are you, dear Angelo? Can you do? No. Ava, how are you, Ava? Yon Jean, how are you, Yon Jean? Ali and Jency, please, guys, send a laughing disco. Jency, how are you, Jency? Thank you so much, Jency. Azza, how are you, Azza? Please, guys, someone send a laughing disco, guys. Fazal, how are you, Fazal? Leuka, sorry, Leuka. Enzo, how are you, Enzo? Leuka, I write your name here. Anybody can send a laughing disco or do a super chat, guys. Amy, how are you, Amy? Asal, how are you, Asal? Hurry up, guys, to write your name in the chat, guys, making the like and subscribing to the channel. Someone has to do a super chat, guys, to make the donation on my Saturday. Vizo, hurry, Vizo. Vazo, how are you, dear Vazo? Please, guys, send a laughing disco, guys. Manu, how are you, Manu? Elsie, how are you, dear Elsie? Martin, please, guys, someone send a laughing disco, guys. Ibra, how are you, Ibra? Okay, guys, I'm going off right now, guys. Take care, guys. Okay, everybody, take care of yourself. I'm going off right now. Thank you so much for joining to sit ring, guys. Lamu is last name Lamu. Yeah. I am going off, guys, right now. Lean, how are you, Lean? Lean is last name Lean. Aza is last name. Asma is last name. Irma is last name. Yeah, guys, I'm going off right now because I am going off right now, so I don't have time to be stay there. Alma is last name because I did not getting support, guys. Yeah, if you can super chat, then I will be there, guys. If you send a laughing disco or send do a super chat, then I will be there to write your name, guys. If anybody are send only a one laughing disco or a super chat for my support, looks the goal, guys. From 2 hours I'm there, I did not have to get support. That is not fair. But anybody can click on the goal, do a super chat and buy goal, guys, for the support. If anybody can do it, guys.